In the middle of the 20th century, the American dream rolled on two wheels with a chrome finish. It was an era of white picket fences, steady routines, and a powerful belief that the future was secure and predictable. For a child in 1960, the world of bicycles was ruled by a company in Chicago called Schwinn. They were the uncontested kings of the sidewalk, producing bikes that were heavy, reliable, and almost impossible to break. Their bicycles symbolized safety, tradition, and trust. The Schwinn family controlled their empire with strict discipline. Convinced they understood American children better than the children understood themselves. Year after year, they continued to manufacture the same upright and sensible bicycles, believing consistency was the key to success. While executives sat confidently in polished boardrooms, surrounded by polished wood and quiet authority, something unexpected was happening far from Chicago. In the dusty lots of Southern California, a silent rebellion was taking shape. Across the country, the culture was shifting. Kids were no longer satisfied with the bulky cruisers their parents bought for them. They wanted bikes that felt fast, wild, and rebellious, like the motorcycles they watched on movie screens. They scavenged scrap heaps for old frames and welded pieces together by hand. They bolted long cushioned seats from broken mopeds onto small bicycle frames. They attached tall, sweeping handlebars that curved like the horns of a steer. These strange machines were called scrapers or choppers. They were rough, improvised, and chaotic, yet they were the most thrilling bicycles anyone had ever seen. These kids had invented a new language of movement and style, but the gatekeepers in Chicago refused to hear it. Then Fritz entered the story, a man who lived between tradition and change. He was a loyal Schwinn employee who respected the company's hierarchy and legacy, but he also listened closely to the streets. In 1962, Fritz traveled to the West Coast and witnessed these homemade creations firsthand. He watched kids perform daring stunts that standard bicycles could never handle. He saw the pride in their eyes as they rode machines built by their own hands, machines that felt personal and powerful. Fritz understood that the industry was standing on the edge of transformation. He saw the future of Schwinn in those dusty lots and felt urgency rise inside him. When he returned to Chicago, he carried a radical idea. He wanted to mass produce a bicycle that captured that rebellious spirit and call it the Stingray. The reaction from Schwinn's leadership was harsh and dismissive. To the older generation, the design looked ugly, unstable, and irresponsible. The small wheels and long seat violated every engineering principle they had defended for decades. They believed the bike was a passing trend that would disappear within a year, and at first they refused to attach the Schwinn name to it. Fritz refused to give up. He knew the brand was slowly turning into a relic, and that if Schwinn did not embrace this movement, someone else would. Eventually, the board reluctantly approved the project, but they gave him no extra budget and no royalties. They treated it as a side experiment meant to silence a persistent employee. Their confidence in their legacy blinded them to the possibility that a mid-level manager could see the future more clearly than the owners. The first prototypes were built in secrecy. Workers on the factory floor sensed something unusual as they assembled these strange compact machines. The bikes looked nothing like anything the assembly line had ever produced before. When the Stingray finally reached the market in 1963, The industry watched with cautious curiosity. Executives expected a small release followed by quiet failure. Instead, a tidal wave of demand swept across the country. Within months, children everywhere were begging for a Stingray. Orders poured in faster than the factory could produce them. Schwinn had stumbled into a cultural gold mine they never believed existed. Overnight, the company transformed from a conservative manufacturer into a symbol of youth rebellion, creativity, and freedom. They became a cultural titan. The Stingray turned into the most successful product in the company's history, and it was more than just a bicycle. It became an identity, a symbol of youth, rebellion, and freedom. As the money poured in, the shadows began to grow. Success did not soften the corporate culture, it hardened it. The leadership claimed credit for a revolution they had originally tried to stop, collecting billions while the man who foresaw the future remained tightly controlled and uncelebrated. They captured lightning, but forgot that they did not own the storm. They believed their dominance came from wisdom and vision, when in reality it came from a lucky collision with a culture they barely understood and were rapidly losing touch with. The stage was set for a monumental rise, but the seeds of collapse were already being watered by the same success that saved them. The Stingray made Schwinn immortal, yet it also marked the beginning of a long, tragic lesson about what happens when a legend stops listening. By the mid-1960s, the Stingray was no longer just a bicycle. It was the heartbeat of American neighborhoods. The Schwinn factory in Chicago ran around the clock to satisfy a demand that seemed endless. Every shipment sold out within hours, and the company reached levels of wealth and influence that few family businesses ever experienced. The Schwinn family began to see themselves as untouchable architects of American childhood. As profits soared, a disconnect formed between the polished glass of the executive suites and the gritty reality of the factory floor. The overwhelming success masked cracks forming in the foundation of the empire. The leadership doubled down on the Stingray's style, adding flamboyant colors like lime and violet, and installing gear shifters that mimicked muscle cars. They understood they were selling a dream of speed and rebellion, even if the bike was just steel and rubber. As designs became more elaborate, production became more expensive. The company obsessed over quality, using thick, heavy steel that made their bikes heavier than almost anything else on the market. The old guard took pride in this, believing weight meant value and durability, and that a bike tough enough to survive a truck was the ultimate symbol of American manufacturing. The world, however, was moving faster, and the heavy steel of Chicago began to feel like an anchor. While the brand soared, the internal environment became increasingly toxic. The Schwinn family maintained rigid, paternalistic control, demanding absolute loyalty while offering little more than steady wages. Fritz, the visionary who had saved the company from irrelevance, became a strange figure inside the organization. He was celebrated in sales figures, but treated as just another subordinate. There were no grand celebrations, no profit sharing, no recognition beyond his job title. The message from the top was simple and brutal. The name on the frame was Schwinn, and that was the only name that mattered. This refusal to share credit or wealth created resentment that simmered beneath the company's bright public image. Then safety concerns began to surface. As the Stingray grew popular for tricks and stunts, reports of injuries increased. The very features that made the bike iconic, high handlebars and the long banana seat, raised the center of gravity and made it easy to tip backward. When children tried wheelies, the bikes often flipped. By the late 1960s, the government started examining the bicycle industry more closely. Safety advocates pointed to the Stingray as a product that valued style over the user's well-being. Schwinn's response reflected the confidence of a king who believed his throne could never be shaken. They refused to redesign the bike or acknowledge the risks. Instead, they used their political and financial power to lobby against stricter regulations. They believed they were above criticism and saw any attempt to change the Stingray as an attack on their legacy. This arrogance extended to their treatment of independent dealers. Owning a Schwinn franchise was considered a golden opportunity, but it came with strict control. Dealers were forced to sell only Schwinn products and follow rigid rules about how their stores should look and operate. Any dealer who complained or tried to sell a competitor's bike was cut off without mercy. The company believed it owned the market and could dictate reality for everyone else. This aggressive behavior created a dangerous vacuum. Smaller and more agile competitors watched closely, waiting for the giant to stumble. At the peak of the Stingray's success, factory workers in Chicago began to feel the strain of relentless production. The working conditions were outdated, and the machinery was decades old. Instead of reinvesting profits into modernizing the plant, the family spent heavily on personal luxuries and maintained a massive corporate overhead. They believed they had reached a golden age that would never end. They stood on the mountaintop, but stopped climbing, unaware that the world was about to accelerate past them. The Stingray gave them everything, but it also gave them a false sense of security. They focused on their past and failed to notice new revolutions emerging, like BMX and mountain biking. The chrome still shined and sales were still high, but the soul of the company was beginning to fade. They were a dynasty built on a single stroke of genius, and they were about to learn how quickly a dynasty can fall when it loses touch with the people who built it. The era of the Stingray was a masterpiece of marketing, but beneath the glossy paint, the metal was already weakening. As the 1970s arrived, the bright neon optimism of the previous decade faded into a more complex and uncertain reality. The energy crisis pushed adults to see bicycles not as toys, but as serious transportation tools. This should have been Schwinn's moment to dominate forever. They had the name, the infrastructure, and the trust of millions. The path to total market control seemed open. Yet the leadership remained obsessed with the past, convinced the heavy, ornamental Stingray style was the only thing people would ever want. They mistook a cultural moment for an unchanging law, and that mistake began their decline. While the world moved toward lightweight 10-speed bikes and agile frames, Schwinn stayed anchored to heavy carbon steel. They dismissed new materials from European and Japanese manufacturers as inferior, believing weight was proof of American quality. This loyalty to tradition made their products obsolete in real time. The children who grew up on Stingrays were now young adults looking for bikes that could handle dirt trails and steep hills. A new movement was rising in the mountains, soon to be known as mountain biking. But the leaders in Chicago dismissed it as another temporary trend. Inside the factory, tension reached a breaking point. The machinery was old, some dating back to the early days of the century. Workers were pushed to produce more with fewer resources, while executives continued to collect massive salaries from shrinking profits. The company was being destroyed by the success it refused to evolve beyond. Fritz tried to warn them again. He saw BMX taking the Stingray's spirit and transforming it into something faster and stronger. He urged the company to invest in lighter materials and modern design, but his warnings were ignored. To the board, he was just an employee who had been lucky once. They believed their name alone could keep them afloat, no matter what they sold. Corporate ego became a parasite, slowly consuming the innovation that once defined the brand. Instead of investing in research and development, the company poured money into legal battles and aggressive marketing to block competitors. They played defense while the industry sprinted ahead. Japanese companies perfected precision shifting and lightweight components, while Schwinn struggled with manufacturing methods stuck in the 1950s. The quality gap became obvious. Cyclists realized imported bikes were not just lighter, they were better. The "Made in America" label, once a symbol of superiority, began to represent technical stagnation. By the late 1970s, the Stingray was becoming a relic of the past. Sales started to decline, but leadership refused to accept reality. They believed more chrome and new colors would bring customers back. They treated the market as captive rather than alive and evolving. This disrespect for consumers betrayed the company's origins. Fritz was increasingly pushed aside. His ideas were treated as annoyances by a family more focused on social status than on the health of their company. The man who had given them their greatest breakthrough became a ghost in his own hallways, watching a once great empire drift toward collapse. The tragedy of this period was not that Schwinn failed to see change coming. The tragedy was that they saw it clearly and chose to ignore it. They had the money, the influence, and the power to buy every innovator in California and Japan many times over. They could have led the mountain bike revolution and the BMX movement. But their pride would not allow them to admit that someone else might have a better idea. They believed they were the kings and that the world should adapt to them. Instead, the world moved on, leaving heavy steel frames and banana seats behind in the dust. The empire still stood, but it was hollow, held together only by the fading momentum of a name that was losing its meaning. As the decade ended, the golden age of the Stingray was over. Shadows stretched across the Chicago plant, and the silence of the assembly line began to feel permanent. The company entered its darkest chapter, not because of a lack of money, but because of a collapse in spirit. When the 1980s arrived, the weight of the past became too heavy for the empire to carry. The bicycle world had transformed completely, but the corridors in Chicago felt frozen in time. Mountain biking, once a fringe movement in California hills, had become a global phenomenon. Every major competitor had adapted, flooding the market with rugged lightweight and versatile designs that made the old Schwinn catalog look like a museum of relics. Instead of responding with innovation, leadership made a decision that sealed their fate. They moved manufacturing out of the United States and shifted production to Asia in a desperate attempt to cut costs and stabilize their finances. In doing so, they handed over their blueprints, processes, and legacy to foreign manufacturers eager to dominate the market. By outsourcing their soul, they trained their own replacements. The Chicago factory, once the heartbeat of American cycling, fell silent. Thousands of skilled workers, many of whom had spent decades building Stingrays and cruisers, were left with nothing but a termination notice and memories of a vanished era. The family that had demanded loyalty for a century showed none in return when profits declined. The final years were a slow collapse. The bikes arriving from overseas were no longer the gold standard. They were generic, uninspired, and lacked the craftsmanship that once made a Schwinn special. The brand still existed on store shelves, but the magic was gone. By 1992, the company that had once controlled more than half of the American market filed for bankruptcy. The empire was dismantled and sold off, eventually becoming a brand owned by multinational investors. The mighty dynasty was reduced to a logo on budget bikes in big box stores. Fritz, the man who had given the company its greatest success with the Stingray, lived to witness the entire collapse. He stayed through the darkest days, watching his vision ignored and discarded. He had saved the company from bankruptcy in 1963, but he could not save it from itself. He died in 2013, remembered by the world as the father of one of the most iconic bicycles in history, yet never fully credited or rewarded by the company he served. He built a vehicle of childhood freedom, but he died knowing that freedom had been traded for short-term profits. The story of the Stingray is often told as a celebration of American childhood, but beneath the nostalgia lies a tragedy of missed opportunities and corporate pride. It stands as a reminder that no icon is too big to fall, and no legacy is too strong to survive unchecked arrogance. The brand still exists today, and the name Schwinn can still be found on store shelves, but it is only a ghost of what it once was. The chrome is thinner, the steel is lighter, and the soul is gone. The true legacy lives in rusted original frames, buried in garages across the country, symbols of a time when innovation came from dirt lots, not boardrooms. The Stingray was a revolution the company tried to stop, then claimed, and finally allowed to die through neglect. It is a story of how a legend can become a shadow when it stops listening to the people who made it great.